I'm Andre. Up to this point in our examination of argumentative and discursive writing, we've looked at logical structure and how we began to put it into our language. Today we're going to try a different perspective, and we're going to start looking at the terminology and the language which we can use to describe that process. You need to know how to use this sort of logical terminology, because perhaps you'll join a debating team and then you'll be able to tell people how you reached the logical conclusion which you have. But before we go there, before we start looking at that, let's recap how logical structure works. You'll remember that from our lesson, we learned how to treat logical progression as if it were a mathematical formula. So we took a claim, added another claim, and finally reached a conclusion as if we were adding numbers to one another. So let's look at this example of that exact process. What we've got here is a first point: developing countries need foreign aid. A second point: Argentina is a developing country. And then really for our equal sign, if you like, we have the conclusion. From these 2 points, we'd have to conclude Argentina needs foreign aid. Now let's think about what we've done again. We've taken the first point, added to it the second point, and then tested with common sense whether we could reach the conclusion. So, developing countries need foreign aid. There we go. Argentina is one of those developing countries. And our logical conclusion: she needs foreign aid. Then, in terms of the common sense about which we've spoken, it's not really far out of the parameters to believe that because Argentina is a developing country, and developing countries by and large need some help from outside, our conclusion is valid: Argentina needs foreign aid. Right, so now we've taken another look at the logical progression. But now let's get to the essence of this lesson today. What we want to look at is the terminology with which to describe that progression. And the first term that I want you to learn is proposition. A proposition is an idea or an assertion which can be true or false. So, if I state that the only reason we work is to make money, I have effectively created a proposition. I've made a statement which you can agree with or disagree with. There are 2 distinct sides to this particular statement. I could say, I work because I like money and I want to make money, but I hate work. And you could argue, well, actually, I quite like work and the money's a nice benefit, but perhaps it's not the only reason I work. The statement we've made here is therefore clearly a proposition because it has not been proven as true or false, and we can agree with it or disagree with it. The next term we need to know is called a premise. A premise is a claim or a conclusion that you have made. Again, remember that it's not yet been proved. Like the proposition, the definitions are very similar. The premise needs to be agreed to. So, for example, I might have stated, as we said, the only reason we work is to make money. But you could very strongly disagree with me. You might believe that other reasons exist for working, for enjoyment, for pleasure. Now, the next important definition is that of the conclusion. A conclusion is the statement reached as the logical end of a set of premises. So let's think about our example. Effectively, I argued that people do work only for money. And then suggested that you argue other people work because they're fulfilled by their jobs. Now, in order to reach this conclusion, both you and I have then supported those arguments, debated them. In fact, we discussed all aspects possibly relevant to our particular situation. And then finally, we reached the conclusion, an agreed conclusion, which reads, some people do work only for money, but others work because they are fulfilled by their jobs. Right, so up to this point, we've looked at the terms proposition, premise, and conclusion. Remember that these describe the process of logical argument. We're looking at the terminology and the language we use to describe argument and discussion. And remember that these terms apply equally to the writing that you do as to the speeches and conversations that you have. The next definition we're going to be looking at is that of argument. An argument is the logical progression of premises. So it's the way you've ordered your claims, the way you've put your logical progression together. Now, in argument, it's also important to know the definition of another word. The word is substantiation. To substantiate is to give logical reasons to support premises. What I'd like you to think about here is how we put proof to the claims we've made. What are the reasons we would give for what we've said? Let's go back to our previous example. Your claim could quite possibly have been that we do not only work for money. And perhaps it could read this way after you've begun to substantiate it. People claim to enjoy their jobs even when those jobs are not very high paying. So all of this vocabulary we've just learned is used to describe what you're doing when discussing or arguing. But I'd like to remind you that perhaps the most important of these words is substantiation, because it's imperative that you prove what you're saying during your argument. Now let's look at a short passage in order to try and apply the vocabulary we've learned. Residents ought to take care of their yards, as it saves on maintenance in the complex. It follows that residents should keep the area in front of their property clean. Right, so were you able to identify where the premise was and its substantiations were? Also, could you see the logical progression in that particular argument? Let's have a look together. Residents ought to take care of their yards. That's basically the premise. And then the substantiations which go with that. Well, the first one is, look here, as it saves on maintenance in the complex. Do you see that the substantiation is a reason given for why residents ought to take care of their yards? Now let's look at how the argument progresses, the logical progression, if you like. We start with residents ought to take care of their yards and end with it follows that residents should keep that area in front of their property clean. So we've begun with the premise, we've added some reasons, and we've ended with what is effectively a conclusion. The progression is complete. So the argument moves from just taking care of your own yard to the point where you need to keep the area in front of your property clean. Right, let's have a quick look at the actual vocabulary, the words this writer used in his argument. We start with the word ought. Now that's the word which almost inevitably indicates to us that a premise is being stated, a claim is being made. There are other examples, as we've learnt, of words you could use instead of ought, words like should or must. Right, now let's look at another type of word, this time the kind which introduces a substantiation. The one we've used here is as. As introduces the reason to support the premise. So, the premise, residents ought to take care of their yards, is supported by it saves on maintenance in the complex. These words are called conjunctions or joining words. They give the reasons for premises. And there are other examples which we've looked at before in this series of lessons. Words like since, for, or because. And then the kind of word which introduces a conclusion. The conclusion of our piece here is residents should keep the area in front of their property clean. This phrase here, it follows that, is the phrase to introduce the conclusion. Now there are other examples of that particular method of introducing conclusion. Words such as therefore, hence, thus, or one may conclude. At this point, I'm sure you'll feel a little more confidence when you hear people using this kind of terminology. And certainly now, you're going to start structuring your own winning arguments. That's all for today. Goodbye.